Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar today. My name is Brandy Jones, and I'm the Director for Programs and Communications at the Samuel Dewitt Proctor Institute for Leadership, Equity, and Justice, also known as the Proctor Institute. The Proctor Institute is a national research center focused on issues of leadership, equity, and justice, and we're located within the Rutgers Graduate School of Education at Rutgers University. Our institute also houses the Rutgers Center for Minority Serving Institutions. We are proud to sponsor today's webinar and excited to get started. Without further ado, I will pass it off to Rafiq Mohammed, who is our moderator for tonight's event. Thanks.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Rafiq Mohammed, and I'm the Dean of the College of Social and Behavioral Sciences at California State University, San Bernardino. I'm also on the Police Commission for the City of Claremont, California, and have the distinct pleasure of being with you all here tonight as the moderator. Now, before we begin, I'd like to thank Rutgers for hosting tonight's event and for allowing this to be possible. I have been asked to introduce tonight's event and give you a little bit more context, and I'll also give you an overview of what the format will be. Insofar as tonight's event is concerned, the webinar tonight corresponds with the release of the first year of Justice Report, and will explore the disproportionate number of Black and Latinx youth who are arrested by the Pomona Police Department, that's Pomona, California. We invite Gente Organizada, a local social action nonprofit organization, and Pomona community members to share their testimony on the advocacy and social justice efforts that they've been involved in over the course of the past several years. This collaboration is a case study and a blueprint for social justice efforts in other cities across the United States. So that is what tonight's event is going to be focused on. Insofar as what's going to happen tonight, I'm going to introduce our distinguished panelists in just a moment. And then after that, there will be a summary of the report that was conducted in partnership with Gente Organizada, titled Compassionate City: Over Policing of Black and Latinx Youth in Pomona, California. And then there will be a Q&A period with the panelists, and we hope to leave some time at the end for members of the audience to ask any questions that they may have. So I am pleased now to introduce our panelists. Our panelists are Jesus Sanchez is the first panelist. He's the son of Mariana and Jose Sanchez, and is a first-generation Chicanx community organizer from Baldwin Park, California. He's the co-founder and executive director of Gente Organizada, a Pomona-based power-building youth-led organization. Prior to Gente, he worked in various community organizing, college access, and youth development roles throughout Southern California. He is a proud alumnus of Mount San Antonio Community College and California State University, Dominguez Hills. Our next panelist is Miranda Sheffield. Miranda Sheffield is a mother, community scholar, and community organizer. Her principles and practices are deeply rooted in Black feminist school of thought. She is she's active in the community as a member of the Police Oversight Starts Today and Pomona United for Stabilized Housing. Sheffield obtained her BA in sociology from Cal State Los Angeles and a master's in human rights law from SOAS University in London, in which she explored the historical legacy of Maroons who are fugitive slaves or self-emancipated slaves. Her community safety record includes her work as a case manager for commercially sexualized exploited children and drafting a federal policy briefing for more evidence-based mentorship programs for foster youth while working in Nancy Pelosi's office. Most recently, she ran for Pomona District 6 City Council under the People's Candidate platform. Miranda currently works at the National Center of Youth Law as a debt-free justice campaign coordinator. Welcome, Miranda. Our next panelist is Frank Carlos Guzman Jr. Frank is a Pomona resident, activist, and community organizer. Currently, Frank is a second-year Master's in Public Policy candidate at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government. In 2020, Frank graduated from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor with a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science and Applied Statistics. Frank has 6+ years of experience in data analysis, political consulting, community organizing, progressive activism, nonprofit management, legislative research, and strategic communications. His expertise carries into working directly with his community through efforts with Gente Organizada and the Pomona Leadership Network. Frank is passionate and committed to social inequity, poverty alleviation, digital governance, and data-driven decision-making in public policy. Welcome to you, Frank. Our next panelist is Bianca N. Haro, a PhD. Bianca is a feminista educator activist, a first-generation college graduate, and a daughter of immigrant parents from Jalisco, Mexico, or Guadalajara, Jalisco, Mexico. In 2020, Bianca graduated from the University of California, Los Angeles Graduate School of Education and Information Studies with a doctorate in education. I'll share a little bias. I had the distinct pleasure of serving on Bianca's dissertation committee, so I know her work very well. Currently, she's a visiting assistant professor of sociology at Pitzer College. Using a critical race feminista praxis, her research examines the factors that push Latina students out of school. Her commitment to research is paired with a dedication to organizing with and for communities of color. She is currently collaborating with Gente Organizada, and Bianca's research agenda is a lifelong commitment to centering the voices of youth who are often overlooked in research, policy, practice, and social justice efforts. Welcome to you, Bianca. Finally, I have the pleasure of introducing Adriana Wong, a senior staff attorney with the ACLU of Southern California and statewide coordinator of police practices advocacy for the ACLU's California affiliates. Adriana's counsel in Gente Organizada v. Pomona, a lawsuit challenging the Pomona Police Department's use of public resources to adopt policies and trainings that conflict with state law created by police lobbying groups. Adriana is a graduate of the University of California, Berkeley and Yale Law School. She clerked on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals for Judge A. Wallace Tashima and on the District Court for the Central District of California for Judge Margaret Morrow. Welcome to you, Adriana. And finally, I would like to give an opportunity for our city council person who just joined us to introduce himself to the group.
Hi, thank you. My name is John Nolte. I am city council person in District 1 in Pomona. I was elected in November 2020. I was also on the council previously from 2012 to 2016. I am an attorney. I represent students with disabilities for a living against school districts. And I've been in Pomona, I think 17 years. I was on the board of the Pomona Economic Opportunity Center, the Day Labor Center. I'm on the board of the Latino Roundtable and was a founder of Pomona United for Stable Housing. I have made it the focus of my term to focus on the most vulnerable populations in Pomona. My belief is that if we can help to stabilize and improve their lives, their quality of life, that it will redound to the benefit of all of us. So I'm really glad to be here today. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilman Nolte, for joining us. It's really wonderful to have a voice from city government on this panel today. So thank you very much. We appreciate it. I would like to now hand the conversation over to Bianca and Frank, who are going to summarize the findings of the report that they produced in partnership with Gente Organizada. The report is titled "The Compassionate City: Over Policing of Black and Latinx Youth in Pomona, California." So Bianca and Frank, feel free to take it away.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Thank you for being here with us today in conversation. Before we get started, we want to open up with a moment of silence for those who we've lost and continue to lose due to COVID-19, which has disproportionately impacted the Black and Latinx community, as well as those who have been killed at the hands of police, including Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Dante Wright, Ma'Khia Bryant, Adam Toledo, Andres Avila, and unfortunately many others. So please join us for a moment of silence. Thank you. With that, I'd like to pass things over onto Dr. Bianca Aro.
Thank you, Frank, for that moment of silence, and good afternoon or evening if folks who are in the East Coast. My name is Bianca Aro. It is truly an honor to be here with you all today and being in conversation with folks across the United States. Before we move on to our conversation, the Q&A portion of this webinar, Frank and I would really like to spend the first few moments to contextualize the report for those who haven't had an opportunity to read through it. And so again, the title of the report is A Compassionate City: Over Policing of Black and Latinx Youth in Pomona, California. And we want to highlight some of the most striking findings and contextualize Pomona, California for many of us who might not know the area or have ever visited.
So of course, one question I ask is why Pomona specifically? So in 2018, the city of Pomona declared itself to be a compassionate city. And with this, within the resolution, the city vowed to embrace compassion as a key value and promised to explore programs and policies that would integrate compassion into the daily lives of its residents. For those who don't know, Pomona is one of the poorest cities in the region and more densely populated than surrounding cities. For additional context, it's a city with a large population of Black, Indigenous, and people of color, including a significant Latinx immigrant population. But we highlight the city of Pomona because it's one of many in the country where consistently city leaders have failed to represent its constituency and their needs sufficiently, while enabling policy that continues to worsen quality of life for historically excluded and the vulnerable populations. So through this, we conclude that the city has been anything but compassionate, even to its youngest community members, as it chooses to fund the criminalization of Black and brown youth with the renewed police presence in schools. Speaking from the heart for a second, as a Pomona resident, this work is very personal to me. I care deeply about my community, and as somebody on the inside, I'm deeply aware of the ways city policy has negatively impacted Pomona youth. I grew up in Pomona and have continually seen how Pomona Police Department continues to criminalize and over-police the Black and Latinx community, including my own family members. So, as a community activist, I do my best to seek out justice-oriented solutions to help better define public safety for all of us here in the city.
Thank you, Frank, for contextualizing us, your city. Our report is in conversation really with organizers and community members across the United States. And really, it echoes the uprisings after the murder of George Floyd, right? And much before that too. But I think we have seen that the murder of George Floyd really heightened this sense of justice, right? And so this report specifically analyzes the Pomona Police Department arrest data from January 2016 to June of 2020, and it highlights some very unsettling findings. For one, Black youth are 4 times more likely to be arrested than their population percentage would suggest, comprising of 22.4% of all youth arrests.
Of all Latinx youth arrested, almost half were charged with a felony, making Latinx youth the most common racial group to be charged with the felony.
Black female youth in Pomona are charged with a misdemeanor and a civil infraction at a rate of 9 times higher than their population percentage would suggest.
And let's not forget that this arrest data indicates Pomona PD is arresting and charging children as young as 11 years old with felonies. Just to round all this data up, almost a third of all arrests by Pomona Police Department are arresting persons ages 25 and younger. So that really contextualizes the extent to which this is a problem.
So, I think these findings are really evident of a few key points. One, that there's a clear anti-Blackness that exists in Pomona, as it is disproportionately arresting Black youth. 2, that the city of Pomona and the Pomona Police Department is invested in incarcerating as opposed to educating or protecting youth. And 3, that over-policing is race and gendered, right? Black female youth are the most impacted, and it's a narrative that is oftentimes invisibilized, that law professor Kimberly Crenshaw has continuously urged us to consider.
So like with this, if Pomona were truly living up to its promise or commitment to being a compassionate city, rather than making the policy choice to arrest young children of color, it would rather invest in youth diversion programs that keep kids out of the criminal justice system. But instead, the city of Pomona, just 2 months ago, agreed to pay millions of dollars for police officers to return to schools and continue hyper-criminalizing our youth of color. And it is just inhumane to treat young people in this way. And this trauma has caused a cycle of generational harm that our community is still learning how to deal with.
And so once again, I'd like to uplift the work of law professor Kimberly Crenshaw, who oftentimes shares that research has created a cycle of invisibility for Black girls specifically. And today I want to reframe that and really highlight what a cycle of visibility can do for youth of color on the ground with community members such as Gente Organizada, who are already centering youth in their work. And so the first is to acknowledge that youth are centered in the framing of the problem, like in this case, over-policing of Black and Latinx youth. The second point, that then after this, information about their circumstances is gathered. And with this information, knowledge of their marginalization is recognized and centered. And once this is created, efforts are taken then to address their problems. And with this, result in efforts and reform efforts and more resources and political will. And so I would argue that this webinar, the report, and everyone who is in conversation with us today, we are in step 3, right? We are all here to learn more about Pomona, about the injustices that occur for youth of color specifically. And our goal really is to get to point number 5. So I do hope that this webinar brings us closer to that point.
So lastly, to round out this portion of the webinar, we invite you all to read through the report and the findings and ask yourself, how is my city contributing to the over-policing of Black and brown youth? We'd like to highlight some recommendations that we've come up with in partnership with Gente Organizada, the ACLU of Southern California, Pomona Youth, and other collaborators. And these are recommendations that we would suggest all cities across the country to consider to help combat this epidemic of police brutality.
Yeah, for one, to divest from police department and reinvest in evidence-based community safety.
2, to establish a city fund to support Black youth, families, and community-based organizations.
3, to establish an independent civilian oversight body with subpoena power and an inspector general.
4, to remove the police department from schools and eliminate police department youth services.
5, to establish a multi-agency pre-arrest youth diversion program.
6, to mandate monthly data reporting by opting into the data collecting and reporting requirements of AB 953 immediately.
And finally, to stop the prosecution of low-level crimes, including sex work. And so we want to end this portion of the webinar with the fact that, similar to other cities across the nation, Pomona has been desensitized to the criminalization that Black and Latinx youth experience, and really to the systemic racism that is very much apparent in law enforcement.
Over-policing takes away the opportunity for young people to just be kids. It disposes of them to a system that does not rehabilitate. Young people have agency, insight, and power to lead, and we just need to give them the opportunity to do so. So with that, I'll turn it back over to Dr. Muhammad, who will take us into the panel section of our program.
Thank you very much for that summary, Frank and Bianca. It was a wonderful job kind of presenting an overview of the work. At this point, we are going to go into the panel discussion with Q&A, but I also wanted to invite members of the audience to participate in this through the Q&A function on Zoom. At the end of this panelist Q&A portion, we will have an opportunity for members of the audience to ask questions that they may have. So please type those into the Q&A function, and we will respond to those toward the end. Right now, I have the first question I'd like to ask. And again, any of the panelists can respond to the questions. The first question I have is, the Compassionate City Report refers to the Pomona Police Department's conduct as malpractice. Would you elaborate on this description and share what aspects of their professional activities you would characterize as negligent or improper?
I can take a first shot at that, I guess.
Thank you. I was just going to start calling on people.
Sure, no problem. And I should mention that my bio doesn't mention probably the most important fact about me for the purpose of this panel, which is that I am a former Pomona resident. But to answer your question, I think the use of the word malpractice in the report is powerful because we're so used to hearing the phrase police practices or even just policing, which is like a neutral term applied to very harmful practices. In particular, the criminalization of youth that's described in this report has very profound effects on the youth that are involved. And so the use of neutral terminology there, I think, glosses over that fact. On the other hand, I think the report does a good job of making clear that these practices are not unique to Pomona, that similar criminalization of youth, racial disparities are happening in police departments across the country, and that some of this is rooted in the origins of policing itself. And so I think to that extent, I think it's not as useful to think about negligence or veering from a standard as much as carrying out harms that are part of the institution of policing in many places. With that said, Pomona Police Department does engage in some conduct that we believe is unlawful, and that's at the core of our lawsuit against the department. They have failed to implement a new state law that heightens the use of force standard in California. And in doing so, they have been essentially following the lead of police association lobbyists that came out after the law was passed, after they failed to prevent it from getting passed and said, oh, this law doesn't do anything at all. And obviously that law was fought for very hard by community members across the state. And so that's at the heart of our lawsuit there, and we're going to keep fighting that fight.
Great, thank you for that. Would anyone else like to weigh in on professional activities of the Pomona Police Department that could be characterized as negligent or improper?
Yeah, I could jump in here and want to lift up the name. I know Frank already acknowledged, but Andres Avila. Andres Avila was a young man who was killed in our community by the hands of Pomona PD, who was unarmed, and who at the time when the police rolled up on him, he was sleeping in his car in a parking lot of a hotel here in our community. This is a case that we've asked District Attorney George Gascon to reopen. It's a case that is still impacting our community, right? A life that we lost here of a young man. So I want to lift up Andres's name, but also speak to the fact that these acknowledgements are crucial and important to ever getting to a point of reconciliation or even healing, right, as a community. Recently, the city, I was surprised to see an acknowledgement of discrimination, but on a different topic, right? So like this was relating to housing, and the city published a report, a city-sponsored report that centered housing and admitted that housing discrimination exists in the city, right? So just reading this around that issue, that's also kind of very, very important to us here. Similar steps need to be taken around policing, right? And acknowledging the discrimination that's taken place and the harm that's been done. So that was a positive step that I've seen the city take, but I think a lot needs to be done when we're speaking about policing of our folks here in Pomona.
Thank you for that, Jesus, and thank you, Adriana, as well. I'll move on to the second question, which is, in the report, you note a positive correlation between the proportion of marginalized group members, people of color in particular, in a given community, and the levels of law enforcement spending. What do you think drives this relationship, and what impact do you think this has on the relationship between the police and communities of color? And again, I'll toss that out to anyone in the group about what drives the relationship between spending and the proportion of people of color, and how that impacts the relationship between the police and communities of color.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start us off with that. I think we can't necessarily talk about this disproportionate number of people of color being policed and incarcerated without really looking at the historical context of the origins of policing. And, you know, in the 17th and 18th century, Southern cities had paid full-time police officers who were really connected to the criminal system. And their job essentially was to be a slave patrol. And they prevented slaves from escaping to the north, right? So the institution of policing itself was a system to patrol and capture slaves, like Black bodies, right? And so I think if police departments are incarcerating a disproportionate number of Black and Latinx youth now, how is it any different than its original purpose? So I think that's key to really understanding why we are still where we're currently at, right? And I think that historical context really drives the relationship and the impact that it has between the police and communities of color today.
Great, thank you, Bianca. Frank, I see you. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry about that. Just to go off of that, you know, first off, just to explain like a positive correlation in like basic terms, you know, on average, law enforcement spending goes up in areas with higher non-white populations. So, you know, to speak to like what drives this relationship, I think Bianca, you know, laid it very well in speaking to the origins of policing. But I think too, there's the idea of the super predator myth that, you know, that the minority is a like homicidal and uncontrollable young person that has contributed to like the heightened criminalization of Black and brown youth. So like, what does this mean for communities of color like Pomona? I think it really contributes to a culture of fear between the community and the police, where a lot of times when people see police in the city, they become scared, or their instinct is to run. Is not an instinct of safety, which is not what the police department should represent in our city. You know, the police is supposed to protect and serve our communities, but it's in fact creating more harm, trauma, and, you know, even killing some of our community members. So yeah, I think that's the consequences of that.
If I could just jump in with a detail about our lawsuit, it's a taxpayer lawsuit, meaning it's brought on behalf of taxpayers of the city of Pomona against the police department, and it alleges that the malpractice that I described previously is wasteful. So I just wanted to point that out, because I do think that another connection that exists is that spending on policing, there's a relationship there to divestment from communities of color, divestment from community resources that serve communities of color, right? And you see that in some of the spending relating to sales taxes in the city of Pomona going so heavily to the police department that we've talked about a little bit in our lawsuit.
Thank you for that, because that actually, I was going to ask a follow-up question that was not one of the questions I intended to ask originally about, you know, some might contend that that additional police spending is a good thing, A, or that police are only deployed to where the crime is, kind of B. But I think, Adriana, you just added some nuance to that, right? Some context that if you divest in other ways, then it destabilizes the community in some other ways and allows for not necessarily social disorganization, but allows for or gives kind of justification or apology for over policing in some kind of ways. Miranda, you were.
Yeah, I just wanted to add to this question real quick, so I know we can move on to our other questions, but I think something really important to think about when we're thinking about the economic issues in the city is that the facts is that 80% of the students who attend Pomona Unified School District qualify for free reduced lunch. And I think it's so important. I really want to lift that up because it tells you truly the demographics of our city, and that most people in this city make below $55,000, which is definitely near the poverty line, right? And our budget for the police is like 10, 15 times more than anything in relation to what it is when we think about schooling in this city. And so for me, when I hear that 80% of our youth qualify for free reduced meals, it really alarms to me that this is an economic justice issue. This is not an issue that is really based in criminal concerns. This is a community that doesn't have enough resources to be able to basically to survive. And so on top of not having enough resources to survive, we're over police as it is. And so I think the values of the budget, if I think about the budget of the police department and how that reflects our community, it says that, you know, we value having a certain type of police presence more than we do about making sure that our community has economic access to be able to take care of the folks here. And I think it's important to lift that up.
Great. Thank you for that addition, Miranda. I'm going to pivot one last time, and just for the benefit of folks who aren't necessarily in or around the immediate Pomona area. But Councilman Nolte, do you have any insights into kind of how the police are funded in Pomona, just in general? Because I know different municipalities fund police differently, and the politics of funding kind of work in different ways. So just briefly, just an overview of how the police are funded in the city of Pomona and what goes into that decision-making process.
Sure. I mean, I'll do this to the best of my ability. I won't call myself an expert on budgeting, but you know, the police are funded. And can you hear me? It looks like people are. You can hear me. Okay, mine's a little weird, but it's funded out of the general fund primarily. The general fund is essentially the part of the budget that's discretionary. You know, most of it goes to funding salaries, including police department salaries. There are grants that we get from state and federal grants for different kinds of things. We use that to the extent we can for, you know, paying for personnel, but also for vehicles and other, you know, equipment, weapons, etc. So grants, but the vast majority of it does come out of the general fund. So if you look at our general fund, and I'm sure actually probably, you know, Frank knows the exact number better than me, but I mean, I think about 58 maybe percent of our general fund budget is spent on public safety, I want to say. That may be police plus fire, but I'm not sure. But a whole big chunk of, you know, certainly more than half, close to 3/4 of general fund budget goes to police and fire, more of that going to police than to fire. Now, that said, it's not very uncommon. So, I mean, you'll find that basically in pretty much any city that you look at. That's pretty normal. Another big thing to think about when you're talking about budgeting for police officers is their pensions, which is true of any city employee, but we have a lot of police officers. So with every new police officer that we hire comes, debt extended over the long term to pay for their pensions, which increases the longer that they are employed by the city. And then, the way that it's determined how much to pay police officers is a negotiation process. So they're represented by unions, and those unions, negotiate under the rules of the National Labor Board. And, we have a team of people at the city, including our human resources manager, the city manager, sometimes an attorney. They've got their representatives and usually an attorney, and there's negotiations that go back and forth for months that are brought to the council. We provide authority back and forth and, negotiate both the salary increases and, different terms about retirement and benefits and vacation time and all that kind of thing. So that's how it gets done, if that was your question.
Absolutely, and thank you very much for that context. I'd like to then, Miranda, you provided a wonderful segue to the next question, which is about schools and youth. So the report describes a youth control complex existing in Pomona schools. What led the authors of the report to this conclusion, and how is this connected to larger issues like the prison industrial complex, the school to prison pipeline, and the general criminalization of Black and Latinx youth?
Yeah, maybe I can start us off with that to start with the definition of the youth control complex. It is a term coined by sociologist Dr. Victor Rios that really highlights the hypercriminalization of youth of color in particular. His work focuses on Black and Latinx, Black and Latino boys specifically in Oakland, California. But I think that in Pomona, the similar context applies, right? So he defines the youth control complex as a system in which schools, police officers, probation officers, community members, and a ton of other public institutions treat young people's everyday behavior as criminal, whether, again, they're in school, we're learning, right? Or whether they're outside in their communities, like at the park playing. And so there's really a number of factors that led us to conclude there's a similar youth control complex in Pomona, California. For one, the Pomona Police Department data that we highlight in the report highlights that children as young as 11-year-old are being arrested, right? So that in and of itself, like, I don't know if folks here in the audience have a family member or sibling who is 11 years old, but that is a very young age, right? To be encountering the criminal system. I think too, Gente Organizada actually recently received disciplinary data after asking the Pomona Unified School District to share that data because it should be public. And preliminary findings reveal that less than 1% of students were referred to school psychologists or given a mental health referral between the years of 2017 and 2021. So I think those are some of the two things that come to mind when you ask this question. I'm sure Frank and Miranda and Jesus have others, maybe even Councilmember Nolte, as that's his expertise as well.
Sure. Would anyone else like to weigh in on the nexus between either the youth control complex and the prison industrial complex, or how it's all tied to the overall criminalization of Black and Latinx youth?
I think that Jesus, we're gonna go. There you go. Yep.
Go for it, Miranda.
Okay. I think something as a parent right now who has a daughter in Pomona Unified School District, and who was really pushing for the school resource officers not to be brought back on campus. Something that for me, that nexus that's very clear is that in the spirit of wanting to bring school resource officers back on campus, there's also this huge fight of saying we don't want to continue to expand the school to prison pipeline, but your solution is to have a presence of school resource officers on campus as a way to address community issues that are taking place. And I think for me, as we continue to think about like what's taking place with the marginalization and then this continuous wave of like kids being pushed through the adult prison system and stuff like that, it's important, I think, to lift up that a lot of the times, even when there is ways of trying to provide some type of reprimand around things taking place on campus, that also comes with this person is still going to be in our community because of the lack of resources. So if you kick them out of the school, if you tell them they're no longer able to stay in the school, a lot of these people still remain in our communities. And I think there's no like one solution into how we figure out how to address these issues without recognizing that most of the time they're more complex and they're community issues that involve like a lot more nitty gritty solutions to it.
Definitely agree with Miranda. And I think the most striking example that I could come up with or know of is like we live in a city that invests basically half of our budget into police department, right? Which is roughly $58 million. And when you look at that same budget, there is $0, 0 cents invested in pre-arrest youth diversion programs. Zero, right? So that speaks volumes, and it's disheartening. It's tragic, really, because those are lives years after years that have been thrown away into the criminal justice system, right? And I think in looking at schools too and examining schools, I recently looked at the California Healthy Kids Survey, which is a California Department of Education survey that is done periodically, I think every 3 or 4 years. And there are always some very interesting questions that are asked to young people on that survey. And one of them asks the kids if they feel cared for by adults in the school setting. And the 5th graders in Pomona Unified, the last time this was conducted, I think was in 2019, 5th graders, 32% of 5th graders said they don't feel cared for by adults in schools. When you look at 9th through 12th grade students in Pomona Unified, 41% said they don't feel cared for by adults in schools, right? So that's striking. And that says a lot to how our young folks feel in navigating this community. So I think there's a lot to be examined when we talk about kind of this youth control complex here in this city.
Great, thank you for that, Jesus. Miranda, you're just shooting me to other questions, providing me transitions. I'm actually going to go a little bit out of sequence here, and because you mentioned the SRO, the school resource officer in the city of Pomona. And so I want to jump ahead a little bit, and I'll come back to other questions I had in mind momentarily. But the report notes some positive impacts from the research that was presented here, community partnerships and activism. And as I wrote, and things have changed, I know, since then. For example, earlier this year, the Pomona Unified School District voted on a budget that did not include a contract with the Pomona Police Department, effectively removing police from schools, but they have recently reinstated that contract. So as we move farther away from the summer of George Floyd, has anyone on the panel noticed, or do you anticipate changes in how the public is thinking about law enforcement in Pomona, or for lack of a better term, regression to the norm, now that we're beyond kind of the immediate shock of George Floyd's murder?
I think a lot of it is about the cycles, is that last year was a year of uprising, a year of truth telling that was taking place. A lot of youth showing up and really showing raw anger, justified anger and emotions around like what has been taking place. And what you haven't seen yet, as you mentioned, Rafiq, this year, is that there's just been this wave of like, you know, how dare y'all go out there and speak truth to power? How dare y'all even attempt to like change a system that is beloved by so many? Is the response you see is that it's never to say that what took place last year was not truth and was not rooted in wanting to change and dismantle a system of harm. What is taking place this year is really about making sure to say that we want to do everything we possibly can to refute the idea that this system will change. And I think, you know, especially when it comes to social movements, a lot of the times you have people who are out in the street who want to make sure to uplift these things, but because of how our governmental structures are set up, really when it comes to like holding the policy the way that we really need to hold it, that takes a whole lot more effort and work. And so it's never really to say that those wins are not happening and that we're not, we shouldn't acknowledge that just because an SRO is brought back to a campus, even though, because even someone like myself, I definitely felt like, oh my gosh, here we go again. Them, you know, not giving any real reason why they're bringing these folks back on campus just for the sake of saying we want the police to eat more ice cream with the kids and campouts with them, you know, like that being like the main thing. I think that a lot of the times with this, it just feels like it's just more for the image and the sanctity of wanting to uphold a certain type of relic of what police mean in this community. I just feel that that's the case. And I think we're getting closer and closer. Sometimes it doesn't feel like that when we're trying to push things in a more progressive manner. It just is a cycle of when you really bring things up in the way that, especially last year.
Yeah, and I think I want to add to that, Miranda, and share that I think Pomona Unified was very comfortable with having no budget during the year where there was online learning because there were no young people on campus, right? Like, I think it was very performative on their end. And even like LA Times, right, published and they were championing the school district. And, you know, all of us who were in school board meetings with the superintendent and others, like we were asking, right, continuously, okay, contract is over. It's not necessarily, you're not going to reinstate it once we come back to in person, right? And yet they did. So I think it speaks back to Miranda's point and to really like, okay, things are back to quote unquote normal, right? Young people are back in schools. And so Black and brown bodies are back into spaces, and we need to continue to control and sort of reinstate this school resource officer, which, by the way, like, a ton of research. There's no evidence-based research that really shares there will be less school shootings or that like campuses will be safer when you have the presence of police in school grounds. And so I think that's a conversation that is overlooked by school districts like a lot, very frequently. So I just wanted to add to some of that that Miranda and Rafiq, you asked.
Great, thank you for that. And I think you both answered, and John, I see you unmute, so I'll toss to you in a second. I think you both kind of answered a question that I kind of had in the back of my mind as well, which is that, you know, you put so much effort into this report and into working with the community to achieve particular ends. And so the removal of the SRO kind of seemed like a win. And so to have it reinstated, you know, for someone who's kind of more narrowly focused or pessimistic like me, it can seem like, you know, that's a setback. But I really like how you reframe that as, you know, just, you know, kind of a 2 steps forward, 1 step back kind of analysis, which I really appreciated. John, go for it.
Sure, thanks. So I'll preface by saying that the way this happens, the SRO thing, is that it's a contract between the school district and the city. So the school district actually pays the city, it ends up being, I believe, around $200,000 for the year in order to basically have the SRO available to them full-time, essentially throughout the school year. So the city council has to approve that contract. So we're basically accepting the contract. So it's kind of that's how it happens physically. That vote came up a while back last month. I was the only council member to vote against approving the contract. for the reasons that Miranda and Bianca have said. I think it was maybe Adriana that wrote the letter that I thought was extremely persuasive, just laying out the research and showing that if there's any clear waste of money, to me, it was clearly a waste of the school district's money, and I didn't want to pay to basically make people feel safe, but not be safe. And I think it's, when you're talking about an educational institution and trying to, help people become citizens, it's important that, a school district, represent to the people things that are true, even if they're not, popular. And I think you can tell by the way that both the school district and the city council voted. I mean, what those votes are like popularity votes. I mean, in a sense, I mean, you can, I don't know if the politician considers themselves, as being swayed by popular opinion. However, statistically, as Frank would tell you, that's how people make their decisions, right? If you're going to be elected by people. So you're looking at, essentially what are people telling you about what they want? And I will say in the community, you hear particularly, so the other thing that hasn't been pointed out is there was a shooting at Pomona High School. Is that the right high school? There was a shooting, yes. And that happened like within the time period of this vote coming back up. And I think that caused a lot of fear. It caused therefore a lot of, desire in the community to feel safe, less looking at, does this make sense at all? Is it going to help anybody? And I think the worst part about it from sort of I guess I would call it like a fairness equity lens, is like, who pays the price for having SROs on campus? Yeah, it's true that, maybe you could even say the vast majority of students might feel safer. They feel safer. They don't interact with police very often. But there are students with disabilities. There are, African-American students who are much more likely to come in contact with these SROs in a negative capacity. They're paying the price for everyone else, not safety, but feeling of safety, which is not a true feeling of safety. That's extremely unfair. And it's unfair in a way, and I know this from being, I'm an attorney representing kids with disabilities, and I have had clients and have one right now whose life has been totally derailed because of encounters with SROs on campus, and the way he was treated, the way that being treated that way in front of your peers makes you see yourself, in terms of what your life is about and what your capabilities are. A lot of trauma and harm that may or may not ever be able to be taken care of. So I just think if we can't do it in schools, like setting aside cities, the city of Pomona, where statistics get a lot more difficult, in my opinion, to sort of understand. I mean, I think intuitively I understand it, but I mean, it's just hard because of the history. But I mean, in schools, we've got adults upon adults, like responsible people supposedly trained to deal with kids and behavior all over the place. Like, if we can't keep police out of that kind of a situation, then how are we ever going to get to the point where we can, keep police out of neighborhoods and things where there actually are, violent situations occasionally and things like that. So I just think schools is the place where I think that these groups here were absolutely right to take a stand on, and I hope we can continue to push for stopping it there as at least a good first step.
Thank you for that, Councilman Nolte. I appreciate that. And that's you've taken over Miranda's job of transitioning to the next question as a wonderful segue. So the next question refers to policing in certain communities. And so in the report, you discuss variables like youth arrest rates and charge levels that indicate the overrepresentation of Black youth in both categories and Latinx youth in the latter. Many people opposed to police reform hold that overrepresentation is not indicative of bias or over-policing. Rather, for the most part, these data accurately capture levels of crime and delinquency committed by members of these respective groups. What is your response to that? That it's not over-policing, it just so happens to be that's where the crime is.
Yeah, I'll start. I think speaking to, I think crime happens everywhere. And if you're a police officer, like if you're looking for crime, you're gonna find it. So I think this plays into, the origins of policing, the super predator myth. and a lot of police officers affiliation with like violent militant groups like police gangs, sheriff gangs, who believe in like, minority control as like a policy objective. Law enforcement patrolling is not uniform. Police over patrol communities of color, and as a result, they find high crime rates like within this population because that's where they are. This just creates a feedback loop of, this is where I'm looking for it. I find it here, and now this is a high crime area. I think if they go look in Phillips Ranch for crime, they can find crime there too. But I mean, as long as I've been in Pomona, like when I see DUI checkpoints, they're always in South Pomona. I never see them in other areas. I think that they're specifically targeting the most vulnerable communities in the city. And that's how we get to where we are.
Frank, let's talk about Phillips Ranch. So for those of you that don't know, Phillips Ranch is probably the most affluent neighborhood part of town. It's southwest, I guess, Pomona, and connected to Diamond Bar, Walnut, Chino Hills. So just everybody could get a sense geographically where it's located. Gente is actually going to be putting out our annual equity report. And one of the things we did this year was examine where youth arrests took place from January 2020 to July 2021. There were only 3 young people arrested in District 5, which District 5 of the City Council in Pomona is predominantly Phillips Ranch, which was the least amount in all council districts. The average, I think, was around 13, 14. So I think that, just to speak to that point in terms of to what Frank said, if police are looking for crimes, they're going to find them, but they're always looking in the most impacted neighborhoods, right? And so that, just to speak to that issue, and we still as a community are arresting really young children. So within that same time frame of 2020 to summer 2021, 13 and 14-year-olds were arrested in our community. And some of them were charged with felonies, right? And again, just speaking to the need to have pre-arrest youth diversion programs in our community. And I think also want to just highlight the importance of not just any diversion program, but a pre-arrest youth diversion program, because that's going to ensure young folks don't have anything on their record, right? And they're still going to have opportunities to pursue different avenues for their own development and survival, right? So I'll stop there.
Great, thank you for that, Jesus. I appreciate that. And let's talk about Phillips Ranch, right? I like that lead in. So going to the next question, I want to remind folks who are watching that if you have questions for any of our panelists, you're welcome to put them in the Q&A, and we will be going to audience questions in about 10 minutes or so. So just to give you a heads up. But the next question we have is, you note relative to other racial and ethnic female groups, Black girls and young women have the highest rates of homicide victimization in the nation, yet their deaths seem to garner proportionally little public and media attention. This brings to mind what's been described as, quote, missing white woman syndrome, and the disparities in media coverage of missing persons. In your opinion, how, if at all, is this related to whom we value in our society and these broader questions of disparate law enforcement practices?
Today's actually kind of like a sad day a little bit, but also like a good day, and that she's transitioned. But today, our beloved, for those who don't know, Bell Hooks passed away today. And she's somebody I think that has always had like such a huge influence ever since I read one of her books called All About Love. and helping me just understand and ground me in like what it means to show up, not just in relationships and the romantic way, but showing up with how you understand relationships with your community, with your family, as your parent and all that. And I, wanted to share something that she had wrote in one of her books, just to start with answering this question. And something she said was, commitment to truth telling lays the groundwork for the openness and honesty that is the heartbeat of love. When we see ourselves as we truly are and accept ourselves, we build the necessary foundation for self-love. We have all heard the maximum, if you do not love yourself, you will be unable to love everyone else. It sounds good, yet more than often, we feel some degree of confusion when we hear this statement. And I think, that's an important statement to think about when we're talking about this particular question, because I feel when we think about Black women, they're the most least loved individuals and thought of and protected folks, not just in the city of Pomona, but just across the board. And I think about what would it look like if we had a city that said, we value this group, this population of Black women so much that we anchor our truths and our beliefs and how we move to protect them and how we move to create a budget that represents them, how we move to address the systemic harms. What would that reality look like if we actually were rooted in that belief? How would that help other groups that have also been oppressed and also been experiencing challenge if we were really moving in that understanding, knowing that Black women are like the most, least concerned, where, harm is known to be happened to us. And it doesn't get addressed until it reaches like, some strong level of being noticed. And I think in the report that came out this year, the equity report, it really showed and illuminated how, there's a decent amount of Black women who engage in sex work and who have been engaging in sex work. And I think everyone wants to do the savior complex of like, we have to save these folks. And let's be clear, there are some individuals who are under the age of 18 who are getting exploited on a regular basis. And we need to continue to find ways to protect those folks. But there are others who have to engage in such type of work because they're locked out of the economy, because of whatever reasons. And it's not a one type of answer when we think about how Black women, particularly in the city of Pomona, are affected, because a lot of the times what's happening is they're just not considered, just straight up, they're just not considered a worthwhile, group to be invested in. And you see that all throughout the equity report and how, young Black girls are arrested more than a lot of other folks. When you think about the sex work, it's young Black women who are really hyper visualizing that too. And how we even talk about that is like difficult for folks to even conceptualize that conversation. And I think it's hard to come up with solutions when people are just struggling from the beginning to conceptualize that. And, it's a topic that I think, given that our city is mostly predominantly a Latinx city and how it's going through different waves, I just think sometimes that it shouldn't matter about what racial demographic makes up the leadership if it's really rooted in values of liberation towards those who are most impacted and the care towards that.
Great, thank you for that, Miranda, and thank you for mentioning the passing of Bell Hooks. She was certainly an amazing figure in lots of different fields, including my own sociology and law and society. So I appreciate you mentioning that. Another tangential question, very briefly. It seems that again, looking at the same question I just asked about missing white woman syndrome and kind of the underrepresentation of missing Black folks, missing Black women in particular. And it seems that there's a value we have a kind of a value of victim kind of way that we kind of approach media coverage of missing persons or people who are murdered, things like that. But my question is, would it be fair to infer from the report that over-policing presents another type of victimization, and that since it's communities of color who tend to be over-policed, and because we tend to value those victims less, that people pay less attention to that? Would that be a fair inference from the report?
I think so. And I want to go back to some of how we started and the issue of, like, I guess the origin of policing, right? Who police were designed to police, and the, I guess, framing of malpractice, right? So here in Pomona, for decades, you've had a police department that has targeted the Black community. And no one within this institution that is supposed to be centering public safety, okay? No one within this institution has ever questioned the fact that the majority of the folks they're arresting were Black, right? Or Latino in this sense too, right? And no one questioned that it was not matching up with the census population data, right? That it was there was some issues there, and the contrast was striking. And I think that speaks back to the origin and why police exist, and a lot of the thinking of officers who are on the street and what they're supposed to be doing and how they gauge success, right? We don't have anyone within these institutions that is introspective, that's actually looking and championing the issues of the community and saying, hey, hold up, we're a public safety institution. Maybe it's not in the best interest of this Black and brown community that we're arresting young people at an alarming rate, that we're charging them with felonies at an alarming rate, that we're only investing in policing and not diversion programs. So I think it's on point. I think it's on point and consistent. And unfortunately, here in Pomona, it persists.
Thank you very much, Jesus. So we have about 6 minutes left before we have to get to audience questions, or 4 minutes, however you want to slice that. So I have two quick questions left for the panel here. The first is about Pomona, and you know, why Pomona? What about Pomona is analogous to the rest of the country? Like, why should people care if is this just a Pomona thing, or are there broader lessons to learn for folks in New Jersey, or folks in DC, or folks in Florida, or wherever else they may be?
I want to jump in and address this really quick. For me personally, and for somebody who is part of the leadership of Gente Organizada, that is a Latinx-led organization, I think it was our responsibility as an organization to uplift this issue, specifically the over-policing of our Black brothers and sisters, right, in Pomona. And you consider the fact too that our city is predominantly led by Latinx folks holding power as well, right? So I think this is important because as our community continues to grow in this country, we don't, some of our young people here that I have the privilege of working with, we're establishing our own community agreements. And one of the agreements that they've identified is don't mimic the oppressor, right? And that is heavy here in Pomona, right? And we want to point that out, that we don't want to do to our neighbors what was done to us, right? Just because we've now achieved or reached these positions of power. So I think this is important here in Pomona, but there's a lot of communities that look just like Pomona, right? And I think it's important for Latino communities to also acknowledge the anti-Blackness and racism that exists within our communities as well, if we're ever going to address them.
I also think, to just add to what Jesus just said, is that there's solidarity against the police in Pomona, actually, even if you know it or if you don't know it, with our communities, because even our Latinx community in Pomona has experienced extremely great harm towards the Pomona Police Department, especially when it comes to like anti-immigration issues, like those checkpoints that Frank was talking about. Myself and Jesus had an opportunity to hear directly from an elder in the community that talked about how the police department and the city of Pomona used its resources to do these checkpoints where you would have lines and lines of not just people who were getting their cars impounded, but they were really trying to use these checkpoints as a way to show that there's undocumented community members here, and how it was such a issue that folks just felt really afraid around that, and that most of that harm came from this police department. So when people tell me about the benevolence of like this police department, how amazing and great it is, it actually has harmed us in all different types of ways as Black folks here, have been over policed. And also when you think about the connection to the immigration concern.
Great, thank you for that, Miranda, and Jesus for weighing in on that question. I am going to switch over right now to audience questions, because I see we have several questions in the Q&A, and I want to ensure that you all have time to respond to those. So I will go to the first question, which is from an audience member named Jesus Albaran. Hello all, thank you for hosting this. I logged in late and apologies if this is already covered. Just learned about SB 823. How has this helped or worked against from moving away from a youth control complex framework? So the question's about SB 823 and how has this helped or worked against moving away from a youth control complex framework?
I think I could speak to that a little bit, and I hope I get it right. I think that's about closing down some of the juvenile camps. I think it could do both, right? And it's like kind of a wait and see, because it's happening in real time. So I know for me, I get really concerned with victories like this when we don't have in place the alternatives to really deal with the trauma that is leading to these incidents or arrest, right? So that's something that even with here in this city, we're trying to build up different alternatives to actually have things set in place, so where young people don't have to be jailed and caged, right? So I think when I look at that, that's where my mind immediately goes, and we really need those resources to build up these alternatives.
Great, thank you, Jesus. Anybody else have any insights on SB 823 before we move on to the next audience question? No obligation, just giving the opportunity. Bianca.
Yeah, I just want to share that I think that criminalization happens beyond like security apparatuses or beyond having like a space where like people are incarcerated, right, and disposed of in a sense. And so even if like juvenile detention centers are closed down and whatnot, that doesn't necessarily mean that young people are not going to be criminalized. I think it's a different, I think it's similar to Jesus, right? There needs to be sort of like, okay, so if we don't have this, like, what is the alternative? What are the resources that we're giving young people as opposed to spending money on like juvenile detention centers and whatnot? And so I think that's something I just wanted us to like push us to consider, because criminalization and sort of like this sort of idea that like Black and brown bodies are deemed as deviant, right? It's not going to go away if with like a sort of a prison abolition like mentality and whatnot. So just wanted to highlight that.
Great, thank you for that, Bianca. Let's go to the next question, which is from either Julian or Julian Lucas. Has Gente Organizada done any research about Pomona youth who may have been charged after being arrested and either referred to youth authority or juvenile hall camps? I ask because in my experience, once a youth becomes a part of the system in California, it's very difficult to be successful within that system.
Good question. Thank you, Julian. Short answer is no, but we are trying to look into this area. And I know that the Los Angeles District Attorney's Office is working to create a dashboard to self-publish a lot of data within their own, the District Attorney's Office here in LA. So we're hoping that that's going to have some information to kind of be able to tell a fuller picture, fuller story of what's happening after arrest. But that's something we're hopefully going to work on in 2022 if we have access to that information.
Sorry, I clicked the wrong button there. Thank you for answering that, Jesus. Let's see, I have another question here from an anonymous attendee. Has anyone reviewed hiring practices of the police? I ask because I met evaluators who revealed they do psych evaluations and then ignore them. It seems like a hiring policy that's in place and is followed regarding hiring would benefit the community.
I can speak to that a little bit unless any of the other panelists would like to. So at the ACLU, along with many other community partners, we have done some work on hiring. This year, our coalition passed a law in California that addresses eligibility for being hired as a police officer. What we were seeing was that police who had harmed communities would just jump from police department to police department and get rehired at new police departments and continue to cause harms in new communities. And so that bill aims to stop that from happening anymore. With that said, I think there's evidence that is in the report that there are police officers in Pomona that have shown themselves to be unfit for being a police officer and continue to remain police officers. But I would really caution against trying to address the kinds of issues that are described in the report from an individual officer perspective, because they're really much more systemic than that. What we see is that very well-meaning people can join a police department, but if the police department has a set policy of targeting particular neighborhoods, those racist policies are going to continue regardless of what's in that officer's heart. So I think that's really what's going on in focus in the report here.
Great, thank you for that, Adriana. I don't see any other, there were a couple of comments in the Q&A, but I don't see any other questions. One may have just popped in. Aha, okay, so we'll go to this one. And let's see, it's from Priscilla. And Priscilla writes, working in the juvenile children's camp / prison, I was once in the presence of a Pomona PD officer while being a caretaker, who a child drawing with chalk and stated, they are like regular Pomona kids. After hearing about the hypercriminalization of BIPOC children in Pomona and the arrests of 13, 14-year-olds, is the normalization of desensitizing children to jail a facet of police practice, documented or undocumented? So is the normalization of desensitizing children to jail a facet of police practice, documented or undocumented? And I'll toss that to any member of the panel that wishes to speak on that, the normalization of desensitizing children to jail being a component of police practice.
I mean, I think a short answer is yes, right? I think it speaks to like Councilmember Nolte's earlier comment about like if we have police within a public institution that's supposed to like educate and like teach young people how to critically think about the world and transition them into whatever next stage of their life, then yeah, it's definitely has been like normalized, right? To arrest young children as young as 11 years old. And we see this not just in Pomona, but across the United States, right? So yeah, I just wanted to respond to that. I don't know if other folks have other things to share.
I think some of the earlier responses to other questions kind of touched upon that with the kind of the super predator kind of mythology and how that contributed to more punitive practices directed toward juvenile offenders. So a great question. Thank you for that question.
I do think just real quick, I do think it's like a weird, very, very weird fetish I would probably use. I would go to that extent. In our city, when you talk to certain leadership about why it's so important that the police officers have this relationship with youth, because they really want to let them know how friendly police officers are, and have these like, you know, great camp out and like, you know, pizza with the police officer, ice cream with the police officer, selfies with police, and all that stuff, right? And really just making them the PR around it is very strong. And I think the desensitizing part of it is that there's never no discussion in this dynamic of like how all those kids one day end up being the ones that the police end up having to arrest, or having to tell them like, you're no longer cute and good to have ice cream with anymore. We now need to throw you into prison. And I think that even in that deliberate method of trying to make sure that everyone in this community has a certain type of beloved respect for the police, there's still also this strong desire to not recognize, you know, that youth don't always stay youth, that you forget about that whole process of, you know, there's no reciprocity around saying that, hey, this police officer one day can violate your rights. This police officer can one day, you know, say some things to you that may not be true to coerce you, that those things are very much as true as anything else. I think it's just a very weird dynamic in this city that happens. And I don't think it's just a Pomona thing. I just think that it's a strong dynamic that happens.
And speaking on the normalization and the title of the report, A Compassionate City, right? That Compassionate Pomona, that is an effort that is led by predominantly white elders in the community here, right? And I think a lot of us, when we saw that and started learning more about what's taking place and a lot of the statistics, the stories that have come out, we took offense. Right? We took offense because it, again, is that it's more propaganda than anything. It's empty because there's been no reflection, no analysis, no introspection of what we're doing here and how young people experience growing up in this city. And it's incredibly dangerous and harmful, right? Because folks then leave this community thinking, hey, we were awarded this empty, symbolic, whatever it is, as a compassionate city, right? And so I just wanted to kind of bring that back to, yes, this is normalized, and connecting it to the title of this report, and it was intentional.
Great, thank you, Jesus. So we have a hard stop in a couple of minutes, in 2 minutes. So I am going to save the very last question for Jesus to share his thoughts on, and also kind of give us some direction in terms of where we may go. But before I do that, I would like to thank everybody who participated in today's webinar, the attendees. Thank you very much for spending this last 90 minutes with us, and certainly thank you to everybody on the panel, Bianca, Frank, Adriana, Jesus, Miranda, John, and Brandy, and Natalie for your behind the scenes work. Thank you all for participating in this wonderful event. And certainly thank you for having me be a part of it. I really enjoyed it and appreciated being here. I'd also like to thank the Proctor Institute for their role in facilitating all of this. So Jesus, you get to bring us home, so to speak, and answer just kind of the question of where do we go from here, and where do you see your work going in the future, and what some next steps for advocacy efforts may be.
Yeah, so in all honesty too, I think that's something that we're still trying to answer ourselves, right? Like in terms of what are next steps, but I could definitely share some observations that I think are important, not just for Pomona, but for other communities as well, right? I think we have to sit back and reflect on the momentum that has been lost ever since the change in leadership at the federal level, and examine neoliberalism in our communities and what that means on a local level and how that impacts issues like this. So much momentum has been lost. We also have to, and I think even be critical of our own movements, that we're actually building out the alternatives to the things we want to eliminate, right? Because that's, I think, been something that has definitely hurt a lot of organizing efforts, because there's so little examples of alternatives in different settings to removing police and being able to point at them as successful, right? But I think for us as an organization, like we're staying true to our mission, and we're gonna continue to center youth within our organization, and not just center them. They're driving this organization. They are the majority of our board of directors. Some of them are on this webinar now. This is their organization. I am, for me personally, here in Pomona with Gente, like we're incredibly excited of what's to come, because they're going to take the wheel pretty soon, completely, right? And I don't think the city's ready for them, but the city doesn't have to be ready for them, because they're going, right? And I think that's the beauty of our young folks. They're not waiting. They're not going to ask for permission. They're going to do, right? And I think it's an approach and energy that is long overdue, and we need it here locally. So yeah, in terms of next steps, I think immediate next steps for us, we are trying desperately to get pre-arrest youth diversion programs implemented in our community. And that's basically where we're at, and hoping to address some of the other things that I brought up.
Well, thank you for that, Jesus. And once again, thank you everybody for participating in this evening's event. I hope you all have a wonderful holiday season. And I believe this brings this webinar to a close, so I wish everyone well. Thank you.